In 1954, a child was born at Freedman's Hospital on the campus of Howard University in Washington, D.C. That was the only hospital the child could be conceived because in 1954, racial segregation was still being practiced. That child was me. So I was born in D.C. and not New York. At the time, D.C. was called Chocolate City because of the large number of African Americans residing there. And as an infant, I remember passing through a dark tunnel and looking into the bright light of a new world full of wonder and curiosity. Yet I was clueless. I had no expectations, but I had come for the ride. Growing up, I remember riding in the backseat of my father's Plymouth and looking through the window into adjacent cars at other people, looking into their souls. I would actually look past the physical because I knew that the soul was still there. And although for the most part of my life, I lived a happy life, at that time, I didn't feel as though I had a need for anything. We lived in areas of DC, most likely under redlining restrictions until we moved into the suburbs of Maryland. We were part of a segregated community with small Black-owned businesses, public schools, and churches. In fact, my dentist was Black, my preacher was Black, my doctor was Black, my pharmacist was Black, and all my neighbors were Black. The school I was in the Honor Society, salutatorian for elementary and also my junior high school graduations, and ranked 8th of all graduates in my high school. And looking back on those years, I can remember my class was treated very differently from the other classes. For instance, we were allowed to have lunches first. We were allowed to go into the gymnasiums first for any games. We were allowed to go into the auditoriums first for any particular performances and special events. And so we were also allowed to go into the playgrounds first for recess. We had privileges and we were proud of them. And as we would march in a straight line in an orderly fashion, I remember seeing the faces of those less fortunate, those who had lesser grades or needed disciplinary action, look at us in envy. I remember we got the better teachers and placed in higher academic classrooms. I felt deserving, I felt special, and I felt good. Yet there was a part of me that didn't feel so good. 25 years later, that feeling was triggered when I went on a trip to Cuba during the revitalization period. And even though there was a travel embargo enforced by America, some American visitors that were able to travel under certain restrictions were being treated superior to Cubans. In fact, it was my first trip outside of the country. And I remember being on the plane saying to myself, wow, you're going to this communist country. And I remember just being full of anxiety, not knowing what to expect. Americans could go into hotels and buy meat and other toiletries that the citizens of Cuba were not allowed to purchase. The government made it illegal for them to have dollars, and we were not allowed to give Cubans dollars. I remember seeing things rationed off and almost empty food pantries and stores, rice, beans, and eggs. Yes, I felt privileged because I was from America, but I didn't feel good about it. I justified it by telling myself, if all you had to eat were beans, and that's all you knew of as food, then you wouldn't miss having a steak. Years later, I traveled to Japan to speak at a peace conference with other people representing peace organizations from all over the world. I remember it because it was during SARS. It was during the SARS virus, and there were lots of people on the plane with masks on. When my plane landed in Osaka, there was a young Japanese girl waiting for me with a sign that read my name. I was escorted to my hotel just as I had been years before when I had arrived in Rio de Janeiro because I knew a senator there that I was delivering some goods for. You see, I didn't have to go through customs. Escorted through customs, people wondered who I was, just like I was in Japan. During my trip to Japan, I stayed at a Marriott hotel, and I was taken by surprise as to how short the beds were. My feet were hanging off the bed for an uncomfortable sleep, and I found myself bowing my head down to go into the bathroom. One morning, a group of us met up for breakfast, and I was introduced to a young woman from South Korea. I was asked, "How did you sleep, Wanda?" And I said, "Not so well." Then they asked the girl from South Korea how she slept, and she said she had the best sleep she ever had because she was used to sleeping on a cold ground. And after hearing that, I didn't feel so good. I knew that I was born an American, and although I was Black, I was American and I had privilege. I had the luxury to travel all over the world, not only because of my working relationship, but I was also married to someone that worked for German Airlines. My former husband, who was of East Indian origin, had never really experienced privilege, especially as it relates to prejudice, until we traveled to South Africa. It was during the new year of 2001. And all the hotels were crowded, so we booked ourselves in an Airbnb in a white woman's home. I never met the woman because when we arrived, I was tired, and I immediately went upstairs to sleep. The next morning, she invited us for breakfast and tea, but she had never met me. When she saw me coming downstairs, she was in shock that he was married to a Black woman. She never looked my way. She totally ignored me the entire time. The entire time we stayed there, only speaking to him. Because he was East Indian, he was regarded at a higher status than myself. The caste system there, that they're considered East Indians over people of mixed race and Blacks. So you see, when you're privileged, you enjoy some special right or advantage that most people don't have. People can be privileged in many different ways, but it always means that they're getting some unusual deal that others probably envy. You know, sometimes we're born with privilege by nature. A tall person like myself has a privilege over a short person. Men enjoy privileges that women don't have. And those born into very wealthy families, like the Rothschilds, the Kardashians, the Carnegies, they never experience being poor or without material satisfaction. On the other side of privilege is prejudice. And there are those that experience prejudice because of the color of their skin and religion. In many countries, because of past events such as slavery and religious differences, systemic racism has prevented many from living fruitful lives. Africans around the globe have suffered from injustices, and Muslims and Christians alike have been murdered because of their religion. Tibetan monks escaped Tibet to keep from being imprisoned by the Chinese government, and Germans were slaughtered slaughtered many Jewish people. You see, privilege is more about problems you don't have than about perks you do. If you are straight, white, male, middle-class American, you may feel privileged, or you may not feel privileged. Say you went to public school, you worked hard, and sometimes you struggled to pay the bills. And you may have never tasted caviar or sat in first class. So for you, the word privilege has always meant a life of luxury that's foreign to you. So it's easy to say that, or comfortable to say that you don't believe the term really applies to you. But of course, you live in a life full of luxuries. For example, you have the luxury of being paid 100% of your worth instead of the 78% your female colleagues are paid. The luxury of not being stopped and pulled over by traffic cops for not using a turn signal, and the luxury of not being afraid of people stopping you because of any false impressions, or because you can afford nice clothes, and because our culture promotes negative images of others who don't look like you, and the luxury of not being fired from your job simply because of who you love. Sometimes privilege is earned. Mother Teresa, Jesus Christ, Mahatma Gandhi, and celebrities are just a few examples of those who've worked to obtain privilege. About 2,500 years ago, Buddha was born to a privileged ruling family. He didn't realize how privileged he was until he left the gates of the palace. He did not know suffering until he went out of the doors of his castle. And after leaving, he met an old man, an ill man, a corpse, and an ascetic. He saw how suffering lay at the end of existence and went on a search for truth to find the truth of the world around him. And he decided to turn away from his life of comfort to find spiritual awareness. And he went on to become a spiritual teacher of enlightenment and helped many understand how to become free of suffering and ultimately achieve salvation. With privilege comes a lot of acknowledgement and also responsibility. You see, the ability to acknowledge that you are privileged requires humility. My mother once told me that you should always look at life in the terms of walking in other people's shoes. See, it gives you an opportunity to demonstrate the higher qualities of spirit, such as kindness, humility, compassion, integrity, and of course, appreciation. I remember once in Brazil, my husband and I were dining at a restaurant in Rio de Janeiro. Seated outside during a beautiful starry night, we enjoyed having drinks and a large pizza. As I began to eat, in the distance I saw a mother with 4 or 5 children climb into a huge trash bin looking for food. And at that moment, I found it very difficult to eat without sharing my food with them. In fact, we bought another pizza for them, and my husband took it to them. I just imagined how it felt to be scouring through a trash bin for food to feed your entire family. With all its wealth and natural beauty, being born in America has been a privilege. I've enjoyed and experienced the luxury of having electricity, the freedom to speak out, to eat healthy food, the ability to have support from the government and nonprofit organizations. Americans have a responsibility to be the beacon of light for other developing countries less fortunate than us. You see, we all have some privilege, some problems we don't have to deal with, and we need to appreciate those luxuries as a first step toward extending them to everyone else. When you step into someone else's shoes, you're able to perceive their experiences, their shortcomings, and sufferings from a human perspective. Putting yourself in someone else's shoes allows us to imagine feeling what another is going through. It allows us to demonstrate our God selves, expressing human qualities such as fairness, kindness, compassion, and honesty. That is what makes America great. And finally, there is a soul's calling in privilege. You can ignore the call or answer the call, reaping the benefits of your life purpose for being here. But you must first ask yourself some deep questions. Why were you born a certain ethnicity in a certain country to parents of a certain economic status? Or why were you born during a certain period of time? This is not a random act by God, but it's a planned journey with purpose. Just think, when you have transitioned and you go for your life review, how will your soul react to what it is seeing? Did your soul actually grow from the human experience? Or will you have to repeat the same lessons not learned, only to come back to repeat them the next lifetime? Prejudice is on the other side of privilege. It's what many experience from those that are privileged. When you're faced with prejudice, you must ask yourself, what did your soul come to learn from the experience of being judged or poorly treated? Perhaps you're learning how to speak up for yourself, to have courage, to have self-worth, self-empowerment, self-love, dignity, release of scarcity thinking, faith, and manifestation no matter what's going on around you. What would have happened if I had had the courage to tell the owner of the Airbnb in South Africa how I felt? At the end of the day, that's why spirituality matters too. It's a privilege to learn how to walk in someone else's shoes. Conversely, by experiencing prejudice, you can learn to get out of the shoes you've been walking in. It's a double-edged sword in which your saving grace is your perception. And that's how human lessons are learned.